The Warren-Matson Debate. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, Ph.D., is professor of the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics at the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Ph.D., is professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. This debate was held at the Curtis-Hixson Convention Hall in Tampa, Florida, on September the 11th through the 14th, 1978. We present the Warren-Matson Debate on the existence of God. The propositions for this debate are as follows. The first proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God in the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the affirmative, and Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the negative of this proposition. The second proposition reads, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does exist. Dr. Thomas B. Warren is in the affirmative, and Dr. Wallace I. Matson is in the negative of this proposition. This production was directed and videotaped by Dr. Rex A. Turner, Jr. and by Dr. Curtis A. Cates, administrators and professors of the Alabama Christian School of Religion, Montgomery, Alabama. This film has been copyrighted and reproduced by the National Christian Press, Incorporated. Any reproductions, use, or sale of this film without written permission from the authorized representative of the National Christian Press is strictly prohibited.
Long-winded being the gun. I'll have to postpone my replies to most of what he said until it comes up in a more natural order. But he had to, by the rules of this debate, which make it these arbitrary 20-minute periods imposed on us, it's true that he had to say something, and so he brings out these charts. I was really disappointed at first because so many of them were familiar from the Flew Warren book, and I thought that perhaps my colleague Tony Flew had educated him about these matters, but apparently not. I see, however, that he has prepared some specially for me. But let me set his mind at rest about a few things. He's worried that I'm going to waffle on atheism and turn into an agnostic, and hence sort of abandon the propositions I've set my name to. Don't worry about that, Dr. Warren. I'm not going to do so. I did say something about Spinozism, and maybe that isn't quite atheism in all respects. But with respect to the God here under discussion, I am, and I say it emphatically, and I'm not going to abandon this unless Dr. Warren convinces me that I ought to, as a reasonable person. I'm not going to abandon the position that the God of the New Testament, who condemns some individuals to eternal punishment in hell, does not exist. Dr. Warren, I'm afraid, didn't listen to my remarks. I did say some things, and one of the things that I said, and if it was wrong, he should have shown me that it was wrong. One of the things I said was that this proposition was not discussed in my book. That is the proposition of tonight. The proposition discussed in my book is, does a being who is perfectly or infinitely powerful, knowledgeable, and good exist? And that's the one where I said there's a conclusive reason, at least it seems conclusive to me, to reject this. But I said I might possibly be wrong and so on. I'm sorry that these very modest expressions of mine, I was only trying to be properly philosophically humble, have been said to be a cop-out. I didn't intend them as such. But we're talking about something different tonight. There was nothing in the book about punishing some individuals eternally in hell. That makes all the difference. I can assert that that being does not exist, cannot exist, couldn't possibly exist. I cannot possibly be mistaken about it. So if that's the kind of dogmatism that Dr. Warren wants me to espouse, well, he is welcome to it. I will do it. I will come to these people. On that issue, I am a complete atheist, and I'm not apologizing, retreating, hedging, waffling, or anything. Is that perfectly clear? I hope. On other matters, let me get back to the modest expressions in my book. You know, Oliver Cromwell engaged in a theological discussion with some other sect of Protestantism at one time, made this famous remark, "Brethren, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, bethink yourselves, you may be wrong." Well, that's always made a powerful impression on me, and I do try to keep it before me. But sometimes I answer it no. I have considered in the bowels of Christ whether I could be wrong about this one, and I'm not. Okay? Now let me give some more meat to Dr. Warren to chew on. Let's see. I was talking when I had to stop about showing that a universal negative involves a contradiction and how this can be done, and you don't get yourself into the usual binds that beset universal negatives. That was just one example of logic, which many people find boring, but it is useful. If there were no logic, there wouldn't be any computers, and wouldn't that be a terrible thing? I think that logic, and I think Dr. Warren agrees with me, at least in verbally on this, that logic has some uses in philosophical theological debates, though, like all fine tools, it needs to be used with care and in an appropriate manner. Remember what I've already called attention to, that I'm a professor of philosophy and I'm visiting Cambridge, don't add up, as a simple-minded logician might think they did, to I'm the visiting professor of philosophy at Cambridge. But now let's get back to the proposition, there's no such thing as a supernatural person. I'm leaving out for the moment the business about perfection and about punishing in hell, just a supernatural person. This universal negative, there's no such thing as a supernatural person. That is rather like there's no such thing as a seven-toed warthog, I think. And I would have been unenthusiastic about that as the subject for debate. And if I were forced to debate it, I would at least have insisted on the privilege of the negative to come last, and of being able to put the burden of proof on the party maintaining that such a being does exist. Dr. Warren, I'm sorry to say, has already made an attempt tonight to shift the burden of proof. He has said that if I can't carry through what I said in my book as the one argument, one positive argument for the non-existence of God, if I can't make that stick, then I've given up my position. Not by any means. The burden of proof in a question like this, like on the question of the existence of any old God, is naturally by convention and in the nature of things too, on the affirmative. This is a point that Anthony Flew made at some length in these previous debates, but I'm afraid they didn't quite get across, namely the presumption of atheism. The atheist triumphs if he can show that there's something wrong with all the arguments of the theist, even if the atheist himself can bring forward no conclusive positive argument. However, we're not going to be in that line because I do have conclusive positive arguments on the issue before us, which, I repeat, is not, there's no such thing as a supernatural person, but rather, there is no such thing as the God of the New Testament who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell. That resembles, there is no such thing as a four-sided triangle. That is to say, what I am maintaining is that Dr. Warren's God is a self-contradictory being, like a four-sided triangle, and therefore can't possibly exist. In fact, I shall maintain this God is a doubly self-contradictory being, a really grotesque logical monster. So, my knowledge that this being does not exist is no big deal. It's what I've already called lazy man's knowledge. To know that this is so, I don't have to find out anything about how the world is, or what happens after I die, or its origin, or whether living matter came from non-living matter, or whether a monkey mother had a human child, or anything like that. All I need to attend to is the meaning of a few English words, such as individual and punish and hell and good. And if I was long-winded before, I'll try to make up for it now. One thing, though, that does make me a little bit anxious is the fact that these debates are to go on for 4 nights. The hall is hired, the audio tape and the videotape people are all here, and the court reporters are engaged. Somebody is counting on 4 nights' work, sweeping up after us and all that. And I don't know whether I can spin out what I have to say for that long. I may wind up conceding my surplus time to Dr. Warren. I hope words will not fail him. As for myself, I can present my arguments very quickly, and I shall do so in a moment. First, though, I think it might be a good idea to establish something that I'm sure Dr. Warren and I agree on. Namely, it's implied in the proposition we're debating, namely that the New Testament does, as a matter of fact, plainly, emphatically, and repeatedly threaten eternal punishment in hell. I would add that the punishment threatened is, or at least includes, being burned, literally being burned in literal fire or something awfully like it. Dr. Warren, I think, hedged just a little bit on this. One of the questions I asked him was this: do you hold that the punishment of individuals in hell is, or at least includes, pain of the kind that we here on earth feel when fire is applied to our bodies? His reply was, it conveys the idea of the intensity of it. Well, I'll take that as agreement. Now, I don't mean oxidized, consumed, or cremated, as indeed happens when we are burnt, rather mercifully, but a process involving the pain that accompanies that kind of chemical alteration. Now, I say this is preached in the New Testament. The principal passage on it is the passage on the last judgment at the conclusion of Matthew chapter 25, from which I quote briefly. Verse 41, quote, then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And verse 46, quote, and these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal, end quote. Note that in this final verse, heaven and hell are put on an exactly equal footing. Now, this and no one will disagree with this, this is one of the solemnest pronouncements of our Lord Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, there have been attempts made, especially since the 17th century, to get around the plain sense of this passage. They mostly hinge on the claim that the Greek word that's here translated as eternal, namely aionion, really means, or at least can mean, not eternal, but just age-long or indefinitely long. But since I'm sure that Dr. Warren is as scornful of such evasions as I am, they need not detain us. I quoted the principal passage. In a hasty survey, I counted in the 3 synoptic gospels 17 mentions of hellfire. To be sure, many of them are duplications, and 7 more mentions of just plain hell, though I found only 2 mentions in the so much less bloodthirsty gospel according to St. John. I think it's noteworthy that except for the worm which dieth not, and wailing and gnashing of teeth, nothing is said about hell, but that it is a place of fire and it is eternal. So the New Testament certainly does teach hellfire. In fact, I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that it's one of the main themes of the New Testament, on a par with such matters as the wickedness of scribes and Pharisees and the fact that Jesus over and over repeats that he will come again in glory during the lifetime of people then living. Well, so hell exists, and if you get there, you're burned. Is it populated? There's another evasion. The cardinal, no less, I'm told, I don't know his name, the cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church is supposed to have said, when backed into a corner about hell, I believe in an eternal hell, eternally vacant. But I think that is a hedge and does not have scriptural authority, in fact, contradicts it. Hell is populated, or will be. In general terms, we're told it is populated by the wicked and those who do iniquity. More specifically, we're told it's populated by those who are angry with their brothers without a cause, Matthew 5. The uncharitable, Matthew 25. Jews, Matthew 27, and St. John, almost all the way through. Blasphemers against the Holy Ghost, Mark 3 and many other places. That, I guess, is a specific count, though it's not clear, at least to me in my ignorance, what constitutes the offense. And all those who believe not, Mark 16 and throughout St. John. Also, rich men. At least they have an awful time escaping it, we're told. There seems, as I read the New Testament, to be some uncertainty about whether hell exists right now. That is, whether individuals are suffering in it right now, at this very moment while we're talking. Or whether it will receive its inhabitants only after the second coming and last judgment. There are various passages that seem to me, at least, to say both these things. I leave it to Dr. Warren to resolve this issue if he chooses to do so. I don't think it matters for the general argument that I shall present. Well, I guess I'm being long-winded again, but I thought I should bring these matters about hell up because of the evident lack of interest in hell, at least where I come from, the godless city of Berkeley. When I went to research this matter at our university library, I found that almost all the books on hell were very old and in storage. That is to say, there's not room in our library for all the books on the shelf, so those that very rarely circulate are put in storage, and you have to order them specially. Well, that was the case with the whole shelf on hell, which is terrible if hell does exist, because then it's a far more horrendous fact than the H-bomb or anything else. Indeed, the writers on hell constantly say that the worst thing that can happen to you in this life is, they constantly recur to this metaphor, like a flea bite compared to the least pain of hell. Well, as I say, this ought to be brought up. Now, as you probably will not surprise you, I reject this whole business as both incredible and repulsive. However, I respect Christians like Dr. Warren and your local heroine, Anita Bryant, who accept all of it. The people I cannot respect, and their name is Legion, are those who no more believe this stuff than I do, but nevertheless claim to be Christians and puff themselves up for being it. I don't know whether our Lord Jesus Christ ever said, "Thou shalt not have it both ways," but it would be an admirable text to find somewhere or other. Well, with these preliminaries out of the way, in the 3 minutes I have, I think I can give you my two arguments. I say, the assertion that God, a being who is going to punish some individuals eternally in hell, exists, is doubly self-contradictory. All right, here are the contradictions and the arguments. Contradiction 1. This one is perfectly general. It applies to any kind of God or indeed any being whatsoever. I say, God can't punish me after my death because I won't be around. I will have ceased to exist. That's what death is, the cessation of the individual's existence. It's obviously a contradiction to say of anything X, both that X doesn't exist at time t and that X is being punished at time t. And God, as Dr. Warren and all reasonable people admit, or indeed insist, God can't bring about a contradiction. Got that? Okay, that's one argument. Here's the second one. Contradiction 2. This is more restricted. It applies only to Dr. Warren's God, who has, among other desirable traits, that of being perfectly good. But it is a contradiction to say of anything X, both that X is perfectly good, or indeed good at all, and also X wills and brings about the infliction of eternal torment on some sentient individual Y. Well, there, I'm finished. Since both these arguments that I just given are obviously logically valid and have true premises, and since either one is by itself sufficient to establish the knowledge, this lazy man's knowledge that I claim to have in the proposition to which I assented, the reasonable thing for me to do is to go on back to Berkeley, I suppose, and get on with something else. Or if it's felt that all these arrangements and so forth that have been made, it's up to us to find something to talk about through Thursday, I'll ask Dr. Warren whether he has any suggestions. And I think I have something like 52 seconds left, but I will yield those to Dr. Warren.
Intermission now. It'll be about a 5 or 6 minute intermission. If you'll stand or desire to walk around a bit, we'll call to order when we get ready to go again. Also about the pre-publication order blanks for the book that is to be printed as a result of this debate. The ushers should be at the back of the building as you exit after the debate proceedings. If you desire either, they will be happy to supply these for you. So ask them which one you want. If you prefer the tape, it is the shorter. If you prefer the book, it is the longer.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm certainly happy to be back before you for the second speech of the evening. And I'd like to begin this part by going over Dr. Matson's efforts thus far and showing you as kindly as I know how to do so, and yet with as much force because of the importance of the matter with which we're dealing, the blunders and errors in which he has involved himself. First of all, I'd like to suggest to you the significance of the fact that he did not look at a single one of the many charts which I presented for his consideration. It therefore means that he is not really paying the attention to the negative arguments that he ought to be and that he obligated himself to do in this discussion. Secondly, he blundered by claiming that the burden is not on me, but on him. And he cited Dr. Anthony Flue's book, The Presumption of Atheism, as an effort to prove that that's where the burden of proof lies. The truth of the matter is, Dr. Flue knows as well as I do that the burden of proof lies upon the affirmative. And it really is a surprise to me that Dr. Matson would come here and say that the burden of proof is on me, not on him. He affirmed the proposition, I know that God does not exist. It is not my responsibility these 2 nights to prove that God does. He's suffering before Wednesday and Thursday night, when I will be under the obligation to prove the existence of God. It is now his responsibility to prove that he knows that God does not exist. Third, he claimed that he didn't need to know anything about the world. Well, Dr. Matson, if there'd ever been a moment that there was nothing existing, there wouldn't be anything existing now. So you've got to know the world exists eternally. And since there is now life, and life did not exist eternally, and since you have admitted in your book that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation, that no life comes except from seed, you are now facing an unget-overable proposition. You are in that prison. You are in a room from which you cannot escape. Fourth, he claimed he didn't need to know about the origin of human life. And yet, in these questions, when I asked him on 9 and 10, if the first human being originated by being born of something non-human, he said no, by failing to answer in the way that I indicated. If he left the box blank, he would give a false answer. And he said that no human being owes its origin to being transformed from something that already existed and then turned into a human being. These are the only 2 possibilities. He therefore admits that no human being owes his origin to evolution. Now, if no human being owes his origin to evolution, and the only way atheism can be true is that evolution is true, it is therefore clear that atheism is not true. And his effort to try to prove his whole case by an alleged conflict in the concept of God simply falls of its own weight. He claimed that he did not need to, or in the 6th place, he admitted that an infinite good God may exist. When I pointed out that in his book, he admitted that for all he knew, God may have created man, and I pointed out that he needed to give up either his proposition in this debate or to give up that book. He said, no, I don't have to do that because I was talking about a good God. But now note the significance of this. He is admitting that for all he knows, an infinite good God may exist. The only problem he has with it is that he can't see that a good God could punish anybody even for one moment, much less for eternity. We'll have more to say about that with some charts later on. Dr. Matson, I hope the significance of that admission is really sinking in upon you. We are here tonight concerned about your soul. I am not here, I assure you, to merely win an argument or to try to be clever or to say something cute. I am concerned about you. We are human beings facing an eternity. And the fact, as you have claimed, that there is a contradiction between a man dying and God punishing is simply overlooking the fact that the God of the Bible says that the soul of man does not die when the body dies. Jesus himself said in Matthew 10:28, be not afraid of him that can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but fear him that's able to destroy both body and soul in hell. And Dr. Matson, the soul does not die when the body dies, and you should have quoted that along with all the other passages that you used. There is no contradiction to your first alleged contradiction, and there is no contradiction to your second alleged contradiction, because God is just as infinite in holiness, righteousness, and justice as he is in love and goodness. If God could tolerate sin, he would not be a God that I could worship. Dr. Matson has called God grotesque and monstrous. But I say that if God claimed to be good while he would tolerate evil, while he would tolerate a man who'd live his life in the blasphemous statements that Dr. Matson has made, and then simply say that nothing has happened, pay no attention to it, or to live his life as Adolf Hitler, with all the terrible monstrosities of the Nazis and of the communists in their efforts, of the murderous efforts for genocide, to try to destroy the Jews, then I would say that God would not be worthy of worship. But God is just as infinite in justice and holiness and righteousness, meaning that he cannot tolerate sin as he is in love and goodness. Dr. Matson claims to know merely from the concept of God that God does not exist, but he falls far short on it. He claims that God punishing constitutes a contradiction, and I've indicated that that does not stand. I urged him in the answer to one of the questions that he explain what he means by pointless suffering and what suffering with point to it would mean, and he paid no attention to it whatever. Notice that by his arguments he has opened the door to the Nazis by way of saying that what they have done is not really objectively wrong. They claim that they were obeying the law of their own land. They were as fully convinced they were right as Dr. Matson is that he is right. What right would he have to go on to Adolf Hitler and say, you are wrong, you are doing the wrong thing? Dr. Matson, will you please explain that to us? He keeps saying that he won't have much to say and that we probably won't have enough to say for 4 nights. Dr. Matson, you're almost convincing me as I listen to your speeches. But I assure you there is enough, far more than for 4 nights, but for much more than that. He claims that God cannot be perfectly good and punished for even one moment, but he admitted that God may have created man, but thinks it's ridiculous that God could raise him from the dead. Notice in his book, I pointed out to you the admission that he said that for all he knows, God may have created man. But he says it's ridiculous to think that man could survive death, that God could raise him from the dead, or that God could cause his soul to survive death. I want now to look at the charts on punishment, the charts which I have indicated to you. Chart 84A will be followed that by 84B and then 84C and D and so on. Now, Dr. Matson, this is chart number 84A. I raised the question, how does the atheist know about eternal punishment? In order for the atheist to know that God does not exist, he must know there will be no eternal punishment. Dr. Matson claims to know that. I want him to explain exactly how he knows. He's claiming to know what is going to be over on the other side of physical death. Secondly, how does the atheist claim to know this to be the case? Third, let the atheist check all of the correct answers below, by deduction from the concept of God, by deduction from the concept of evil, by deduction from the concept of sin, by deduction from the concept of man, by deduction from the empirical fact of pain and or suffering, or by deduction from the empirical fact that matter is eternal. We need to know what he says about that, or is it something else that we have not listed? Incidentally, he complained a bit about my using some of the charts that I had used with Dr. Flew. Well, Dr. Matson, I thought they worked so well with him that I just saved them over for you. There are just some more things and some questions that Dr. Flew hadn't answered that are also going to be used. And there are more charts. There's no reason to change it when you have the truth. 84b, the infinite love and the infinite justice of God are compatible. Now here is really all he has said. This is everything about it. He's going to ignore his responsibility about the eternality of matter, about life coming from non-life, about human life coming from non-human life, in spite of the fact of the statements that he's made, all to the contrary, that no life comes from something that isn't seed. He's going to ignore all of that and base all of his case on this. But notice, the infinite love and justice of God are compatible with at least 1 minute of punishment. He says, no, it isn't. With at least 1 minute of punishment for sin after one's or during life is sin. If God did exist, and if he committed sin, Would it be right? Would it fit with the justice and the love of God for God to punish him even one moment? Is any punishment at all for anything? As a man who took 7 nurses, one at a time, and executed them. As the Nazis put the Jews in the gas chamber, when they put them in boxcars pitched with quicklime and died a horrible death. Were they worthy of any punishment whatever, even a slap on the wrist? Those who are now catching little girls, 8, 9, and 10 years of age, beating them, drugging them, and forcing them to prostitution. Dr. Matson, are they deserving of even 1 minute, 1 moment of any sort of punishment? All right, let's go on to the next one. 84C. I'd like for Dr. Matson to tell us, I know that it's possible the infinite justice of God might entail after this earthly life is over, at least 1 month and so on. He has already answered this by saying absolutely none at all. He knows that the character of God is such that, or the goodness of God is such that it simply rules out any punishment whatever. Now, how does Matson know what the punishment for sin should be? Now, we're talking about the existence of God. Granted, even for him, it's a counterfactual hypothesis. He doesn't believe it. But if God would exist, how would he know what the punishment for sin should be? By intuition? By deduction from the concept of God? By deduction from the concept of sin? By deduction from empirical fact? By deduction from the combination of the concept of God? From something else? What? He needs to tell us how he decided it. It's got to be something more than assertion. Let's go on to the degrees of punishment and reward. 84F. The Bible makes clear that God is a just God and that he will punish man according to his works. Why degrees of reward and punishment? Because it is just, because it's biblical. It is just. Human laws recognize that some crimes are deserving of more punishment than other crimes. One who commits a crime of passion does not receive as much of the type of punishment that one does who commits a premeditated crime. Human laws recognize that a small child who steals a box of candy is not punished as a man who rapes and murders an 8-year-old child. If human laws drafted by men with their human weaknesses and faults make a distinction as to punishment, then how much more is the perfect lawgiver and judge of all the earth, God, able to recognize degrees not only of punishment, but also of reward. It is biblical. Here are passages showing that, but I'll not take the time to go into that detail. Now let us turn to the charts on evil. Charts 36, beginning with chart number 36. Notice that he has said there is one and only one argument offered as a positive reason for believing that God does not exist, and that is that his existence is incompatible with the imperfections of the world. That argument is that if an infinite and perfect being exists, then whatever else exists must be compatible with his will. Only the existence of perfection is compatible with the will of a perfect being. The world is not perfect, therefore an infinite and perfect being does not exist. Now, I will show you as we proceed that there's something wrong with this argument. But right now, I want us to look at chart 18J and K to look at the concept of God. Now, as we look at the concept of God, it is a certain misappropriation of biblical teaching to simply pick out one point, let us say goodness, love, and mercy, and neglect the fact of the power of God, or the justice and righteousness and holiness of God. There is such a thing as retribution. The Bible teaches, and let us look, incidentally, be getting ready for the next chart on the chart on the admission of defeat in regard to punishment. You may find that, Brother Deaver, if you will, please. Now notice, when only God exists, again, I know this is counterfactual for Dr. Matson, but now suppose that nothing but God exists before the creation of the world. He cannot then argue that something is evil in the world and God is incompatible with that. Here now, simply looking at the concept of God, which is really what he's been arguing, he has to prove that the goodness of God is incompatible with the justice and righteousness of God. God is holy, righteous, and cannot tolerate evil. Therefore, there is no contradiction, as Dr. Matson has alleged, in God's punishment man for his wrong. In fact, it would be otherwise if he were not to punish man. Now I want to notice, in regard to his point on chart number 4G, that there is no responsibility upon his part to prove the origin of man. 4G. If the theory of evolution is false, then atheism is false. The theory of evolution is false. Dr. Matson has admitted it in his answers to the questions, and therefore, that is in regarding the matter of spontaneous generation, and therefore it follows that atheism is false. My friends, it's the case that we are here either by creation or by evolution. It cannot be both. It must be one or the other. They exhaust the possibilities. If it is by creation, then God exists. If it is by evolution, then man was either born of something that was non-human, or he was transformed from something that was non-human. Dr. Matson himself has admitted that both of those are false. It is false that man has been born of something non-human. It is false that man has been transformed from something that is non-human. Putting those two together, it is therefore clear that it is false that man was either born or transformed from something non-human. Therefore, it follows that evolution is false. Now, going back to our original proposition that we are here either by creation or by evolution, since we have shown that evolution is false, it therefore follows that creation is true by disjunctive syllogism. Dr. Matson has indicated the value of logic, and I insist upon it as well. And therefore, I have shown that he does have the responsibility of facing up to the eternality of matter, to the origin of life, to the origin of human life, and some of the marvelous and wonderful things about the human life.
2 minutes.
All right, 2 minutes. Now I want us to look at charts 68 L, M, N, and L, M, and N in the closing moments of our study. A4K. All right, 84K. All right. Atheist admits defeat, and I mean by that, Dr. Matson, in regard to eternal punishment. If the atheist grants that God, who is infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for some length of time, say X, after this life is over, no, I'm sorry, that is not the chart that I wanted. Let's go. All right. What law did the Nazis violate? True or false? In torturing and murdering 6 million Jews, Jewish men, women, and children, the Nazis were guilty of real objective moral wrong. Is that true or false? In doing so, the Nazis really did deserve to be accused, tried, found guilty, and punished by the authorities of Great Britain, United States of America, and others. The Nazis did real objective wrong because they violated only Nazi law, the law of England, and so on. I want him to tell us what they did or what it was in their case that made it wrong, if indeed it was wrong. Notice the defense of the Nazis were, we were in our own nation, obeying our own law. We were not amenable to the law of Russia, of England, the United States. Therefore, your law had nothing whatever to do with us. Therefore, we did right. The Germans would say, the Nazis would say, we did right. The Jews would say, you did wrong. Is there no objective reference by which to decide it? If so, then all the punishment which they received was completely beside the point. And in fact, if there is no objective reference by which to evaluate human behavior, then there is nothing any more wrong with taking a sledgehammer and smashing the head of a child than of taking the same hammer and smashing a cockroach. Indeed, it's the case, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. And that's the position that Dr. Matson is upholding before you tonight.